It was a cold evening when Edward first noticed something strange. He had been walking down a narrow alleyway, the kind of alley that seemed to stretch on forever, always just a little too quiet for comfort. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving only the dim glow of the streetlights to illuminate the pavement. As he walked, his thoughts consumed him. Work, relationships, mundane worries. But then his attention shifted. It started with a flicker, barely noticeable at first, like a trick of the light. His eyes darted down to his feet, expecting to see the usual silhouette of his shadow, stretched long on the ground. But something was off. The shadow seemed to linger a little too long, pulling at the edges as though it were caught in a breeze, though the air was still. Edward paused, a chill creeping up his spine. He looked around, but the alley was deserted. The only sound was the faint echo of his footsteps against the cold concrete. He took another step forward, and again his shadow did something odd. It didn't exactly mimic his movements, at least not in the way it should have. It seemed to lag behind for a fraction of a second before catching up, as though it had a mind of its own. Confused, he quickened his pace, trying to brush off the unsettling feeling that had begun to grow. But no matter how fast he walked, his shadow seemed to move differently. When he turned, it took a moment longer to follow. He tried stopping and standing still for a few seconds, hoping that whatever odd sensation he was feeling would pass. But his shadow didn't stop either. It didn't sit still, didn't remain attached to him in the way it was supposed to. Instead, it began to wave, a gentle movement, just a slight shifting of the edges. Not quite a wave, but more like a gesture, a beckoning that came from deep within the darkness. Edward's heart skipped a beat. He could almost swear the shadow was trying to communicate with him, trying to get his attention. He stepped back, his breath catching in his throat as he felt an overwhelming sense of being watched. There was no one else around, no one to notice. But somehow, in the eerie quiet of the alley, he wasn't alone. With a shaky breath, he turned on his heel and walked faster. His mind was racing, filled with thoughts that didn't make sense, trying to rationalize the strange sight he had just witnessed. It was probably nothing, he told himself. Maybe the light was playing tricks on him. Maybe his eyes were tired. But the shadow followed. It lingered, stretching longer than it should as he moved away. He stopped again, heart pounding, and looked down. It remained behind him, twitching ever so slightly, as if it had its own will, its own purpose. He took another step back, carefully keeping his eyes trained on the ground beneath him. His shadow seemed to sway, almost as though it were a separate entity, alive and aware of his every movement. It tilted, turning as though it were watching him now, not just mimicking him. The sensation was growing stronger, more oppressive, and with every movement he made, the shadow seemed to become more erratic. Every time he looked back, it was just a little off, more stretched, more distorted, as though something were trying to break free from it. It was then that Edward realized he could no longer just walk away from it. No matter how fast or slow he moved, it remained at his side, out of sync, but always there, always in the corner of his vision. As days passed, the unsettling presence of his shadow became harder to ignore. It wasn't just following him, it was waiting. Every time he tried to move away, it remained. When he stopped walking, it seemed to linger with him, waiting for him to make the next move. The longer he tried to shake it off, the more distinct it became in its own movements. Sometimes it would linger on the edges, wavering in the distance as if it were watching him. Other times it would stretch unnaturally, clawing its way across the ground behind him. Edward found himself unable to focus on anything else. He couldn't even make it through a meal without looking down, dreading the moment when he would see it. He tried to rationalize, telling himself that it was just his mind playing tricks on him. But the persistent feeling remained, an invisible weight pressing down on him. He couldn't escape it. He couldn't outrun it. One night, the quiet of his apartment was shattered by an overwhelming sense of dread. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed deeper than before, more oppressive. Edward couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He stood in front of the mirror, staring at his reflection. There, in the dim light, he saw it again. The shadow. It was different now. It wasn't just mimicking him, it was stepping away. Slowly, deliberately, it began to crawl off of the floor, lifting itself from where it had been cast by the light. Inching closer to the wall, it pulled away, separating itself from his body completely until it stood on its own, no longer tethered to him. Edward's breath caught in his throat. He tried to step back, but the shadow remained, detached and free. It was no longer a reflection of his own movement, no longer following his commands. It was moving on its own now, separate from him, free to wander where it pleased. The moment stretched out, a silent tension filling the room. Edward's legs were rooted to the spot. He couldn't move. He couldn't look away. The shadow stood, shifting in place as if considering its next move, waiting for something. Edward's pulse raced. Was it waiting for him to acknowledge it? Or was it waiting for something far worse? A sudden sharp noise broke the silence, like a crack or a snap, and before he could comprehend what was happening, the shadow began to move again. This time, it didn't stay in place. It shifted toward the corner of the room, sliding across the floor as if alive, slithering away from him. It was no longer the faint distortion of light it had once been, no longer a mere silhouette clinging to his movements. Now it was its own entity, an ominous creeping presence that had freed itself from the confines of his body. And as it slid further into the darkness, Edward realized with a shuddering breath that he no longer controlled it. It had gone. The days following that night were a blur of confusion and fear. Edward had never known true terror until now. It was no longer the vague sense of unease that plagued him in the moments after he'd first noticed his shadow's odd behavior. No, it had grown into something deeper, something darker, something that filled him with an unrelenting dread. The shadow didn't return to him, not directly anyway. At first he thought it was simply gone. After that night, when it had slipped away from his body, he never saw it again. Not in his reflection, not in the corners of his room, not at the edges of his sight. He could walk through the city without seeing it stretch behind him on the pavement. The absence was a strange comfort, but also a constant reminder of how things had shifted, how far from ordinary his life had become. He woke up each morning, checking his reflection in the bathroom mirror, almost expecting to see it once again clinging to his form like an unwanted passenger. He would turn his body, looking for any movement, any sign of its return, but there was nothing. His shadow was gone. Days passed, and with them, Edward began to feel a sense of relief. He even began to wonder if he had imagined the whole thing, if it had all been a trick of his mind, brought on by stress or lack of sleep. Life started to return to its normal rhythm. He went to work, met with friends, spent time at his favorite cafes, and gradually the feeling of being haunted, of being watched, faded away. But it didn't last long. One evening, as the sun set and the sky darkened to a bruised purple, Edward found himself walking through the same alley where it all began. The air was cool, the kind of evening chill that made your breath visible. But there was nothing remarkable about the moment. He wasn't thinking of the shadow. It had slipped from his mind for the time being, and his steps were light as he navigated the narrow street, a place he'd walked countless times before without a second thought. Then it happened again. A flicker, just like the first time, caught the corner of his eye. He turned his head, half expecting to see a trick of the fading light. But no, it was something else entirely. His shadow stretched out before him, tall and long, like a dark specter on the pavement. For a split second, he felt that familiar unease wash over him, the same creeping sensation that had clung to him in the alley months before. But this time, something was different. He hadn't seen his shadow like this before. It wasn't quite right. It was still attached to him, but there was a flicker to it. It seemed to hesitate for a moment, as though it were unsure of its position in the world. He stopped walking. The shadow stopped too. At first, he thought it was just his mind playing tricks again. He shifted his weight, taking a few steps in the other direction, trying to test his theory. But the shadow, strangely, eerily, didn't mirror his movements exactly. It lagged behind. For a second, it appeared almost as if it was watching him rather than mimicking his every move. Edward's stomach turned. He couldn't tear his eyes away from it now. It was shifting, moving at its own pace. When he stepped to the right, it followed, but slower, as though it needed more time to catch up. When he moved forward, it hesitated before stretching out ahead of him, almost like it was trying to lead him. He couldn't understand it. This was no longer the shadow he'd once known. This was something else, something wrong. He tried to shake off the feeling, dismissing it as just his imagination running wild. He turned down another street, heading home. But as he walked, he noticed that the shadow was still with him. No matter how far he went, no matter how fast he moved, it didn't let go. As the days passed, the shadow's behavior grew even more erratic. It no longer simply followed him. Now it would linger when he walked away, stretching itself out across walls and floors, refusing to remain attached to his feet. It wasn't even just at night anymore. It appeared during the day, whenever he stepped into sunlight or into a shadowed room. Edward found himself growing more and more paranoid. The shadow wasn't like the one he'd known. It wasn't just an absence of light anymore, not just a reflection of himself. It seemed to have a life of its own. He couldn't stop it, couldn't control it. It lingered when he walked away, and sometimes it would wave when he didn't. A subtle, gentle ripple of movement, a fluid wave of darkness. One evening, after a long day at work, Edward found himself walking home late, lost in his thoughts, when he saw it again. This time, it was standing ahead of him. He froze. The shadow was no longer just an extension of his own movements. It had detached entirely from him. Standing in the middle of the street, a dark figure, against the dim glow of the streetlights. The shape of it was unmistakable. It was there, distinct from his body, fully separate from his form. For a moment, he stood rooted in place, unable to move, unable to look away. It was like something that had once been a part of him had now grown into its own being, separate, independent, free from the boundaries of his body. It didn't move, didn't twist or shift as it had in the past. It just stood there. He backed away slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't understand it. What was this? How had it become so independent, so alive? The shadow didn't follow him anymore. It waited. It seemed to be observing him from its position on the pavement, as though waiting for him to make the next move. The fear that had been building in his chest now gripped him fully. He wasn't sure what would happen next. Would it come after him? Would it remain standing there forever? As if in answer to his unspoken question, the shadow began to stretch itself across the street, slowly elongating, reaching outward as though it were trying to expand beyond its original form. Edward's legs shook. He turned and ran faster than he ever had before. He didn't care where he was going. All that mattered was that he needed to escape, to get away from it before it caught him. But the shadow wasn't done. No, it didn't follow him in the way he had expected. Instead, it began to move at its own pace, drifting like smoke along the ground. It didn't chase after him, no, it moved with purpose just behind him, as though it had a plan. It stayed with him, always in the periphery, never fully out of his sight. And as he ran, he realized with horror that it wasn't just staying with him, it was learning. It wasn't just mimicking his movements anymore, it was anticipating them, responding before he even made a move. When he turned left, it followed, as though it had always known the direction he would take. When he stumbled, it stretched and coiled, wrapping itself around corners like a predator, waiting for its prey to falter. By the time he reached the safety of his apartment, breathless and terrified, he knew it was only a matter of time before the shadow found a way to break in. It would follow him. It would wait for him. It would learn to stay with him even inside his walls, inside his mind. And then it would be free to do what it had always wanted, become more than just a shadow. Edward collapsed on the floor of his apartment, eyes fixed on the dark corners of the room. He couldn't escape. It was already inside. It was waiting for him to move again. The shadows in Edward's apartment seemed to pulse and thrum with a life of their own. The dim light from the street outside spilled in through the window, creating a play of light and dark that shifted like living entities across the walls. Edward pressed himself against the far wall, trying to make himself as small as possible, as if he could somehow become invisible, escape from the malevolent presence that had consumed his life. He could feel it, the shadow, lurking just beyond the edges of the light, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The way it moved, the way it learned from him, filled him with a primal dread. It wasn't just a figment of his imagination anymore. It had grown beyond that, evolving into something darker, something more sinister. As he sat there, his heart pounding in his chest, he began to hear a faint whisper. It was soft, almost like the rustle of leaves in the wind, yet it felt as though it were echoing through the very fabric of his mind. The whispers called out to him, beckoning him to listen. The sound twisted in his ears, wrapping around his thoughts, a melody of darkness that promised understanding and freedom. He shook his head, trying to block it out, but the whispers only grew louder, resonating with his deepest fears and desires. It was as if the shadow was trying to communicate with him, to pull him deeper into its web of darkness. He had to fight it. He had to resist. But the more he tried to push it away, the stronger the pull became. In a desperate attempt to reclaim his life, Edward stood up, his legs shaky but resolute. He needed to confront it, to take back control. He had spent too long living in fear, too long running from something that was now a part of him. It was time to face it head on, time to understand what it wanted. Taking a deep breath, he stepped toward the center of the room, the light from the window casting a protective glow around him. He could feel the coldness of the shadows pressing against the edges of the light. Waiting, watching. Edward raised his voice, though it trembled with uncertainty. "I'm not afraid of you." The room fell silent. For a moment, everything hung in the balance, the tension thickening the air until it felt almost tangible. The whispers stopped, the darkness paused, as if considering his words. And then, in the dim light, he saw it. A ripple in the shadow, a flicker that danced along the edges of the darkness. It shifted, taking on a shape that was vaguely familiar. Edward squinted, his heart racing, trying to make sense of it. The shadow began to morph, taking on the silhouette of a figure, its edges fluid and undulating like smoke. It wasn't just a shadow anymore, it was forming, coalescing into something more concrete, more defined. Fear mingled with curiosity as Edward watched the transformation unfold. The figure began to take shape, its features still shrouded in darkness but unmistakably human. It stood there, staring back at him with eyes that glimmered like the night sky, reflecting the starlight that filtered through the window. "Why do you haunt me?" Edward whispered, his voice trembling but filled with an odd sense of resolve. The figure in the shadows tilted its head, as if considering his question. The whispers returned, but now they were softer, almost soothing. They wrapped around him, lulling him into a state of calm. "I am not your enemy," it seemed to say, though the words were more felt than heard. "I am part of you, a reflection of your fears, your desires, your hidden truths." With every word, Edward felt a wave of recognition wash over him. The shadow wasn't just a malevolent force. It was a manifestation of everything he had tried to suppress. The fears he had buried deep within himself, the anxiety of never being enough, the sorrow of lost relationships, the despair of unfulfilled dreams, were all embodied in this dark figure. The realization struck him like a bolt of lightning. He had spent so long running from this darkness, trying to escape the parts of himself that he deemed unworthy or frightening. But what if, instead of fighting it, he embraced it? What if he acknowledged the shadow as part of his journey, part of his growth? Taking a step closer, Edward extended his hand toward the shadow. "I see you. I see all that you represent, and I'm ready to face you." The shadow hesitated, flickering uncertainly, but then began to move toward him, slow and deliberate. The tension in the room shifted, the air growing warmer as the figure stepped closer, the darkness merging with the light around them. Edward felt a rush of energy as their connection deepened, an inexplicable bond forming between them. He could feel the weight of his fears beginning to lift, the darkness inside him transforming into something lighter, something that no longer held him captive. The shadows that had once been oppressive were now swirling around him, dancing playfully as if celebrating his newfound acceptance. The figure's features became clearer, revealing not a terrifying specter, but a reflection of himself, flawed, imperfect, but undeniably whole. In that moment, Edward understood that the shadow was not a foe to be vanquished, but a part of himself to be embraced. It was a reminder that darkness existed alongside the light, that both were necessary for growth and understanding. The fear that had consumed him for so long began to dissipate, replaced by a profound sense of peace. As the figure melted back into the shadows, Edward felt a final wave of connection wash over him, a silent promise that he would carry the lessons learned into the light. He was no longer a prisoner of his fears. He was free. The shadows in the room shifted and transformed, no longer foreboding, but rather a canvas for new beginnings. Edward stepped back, looking around at the space that had once felt so constricting. Now it was alive with possibilities, the darkness blending harmoniously with the light. From that day forward, he embraced the shadows, acknowledging their presence without fear. They became a part of his life, a reminder of the depths he had explored and the courage he had found. The shadow that had once haunted him now served as a source of strength, a guide to navigate the complexities of existence. With each passing day, Edward learned to listen to the whispers of his shadow, to embrace the fears and insecurities that came with being human. He transformed his experiences into stories, sharing his journey with others who might also feel lost in their darkness. Through his words, he connected with people from all walks of life, fostering understanding and compassion. The shadows became a symbol of resilience, a reminder that we all carry our darkness, but it does not define us. Instead, it enriches our experiences, weaving a tapestry of light and shadow that is uniquely our own. Edward's life blossomed in ways he had never imagined. He found joy in the simple moments, laughing with friends, exploring new places, and relishing the beauty of existence. The darkness was no longer something to fear. It was a part of his journey, and in embracing it, he found liberation. Years later, as he stood on a stage sharing his story with a captivated audience, he realized how far he had come. The journey had not been easy, but every challenge had shaped him into the person he was today. And as he spoke, he looked out into the sea of faces, seeing the flicker of recognition in their eyes. He knew he was not alone. They all carried their shadows, their burdens, their fears. With a smile, Edward concluded his tale, a testament to the strength found in embracing one's darkness. The audience erupted into applause, a wave of warmth washing over him. He felt a sense of connection with each person in that room, a shared understanding of the shadows that lingered in their lives. As he stepped off the stage, he felt lighter than air, free from the weight of his past. The shadows no longer haunted him. They danced joyfully around him, a constant reminder of his journey toward acceptance. Edward had become a storyteller, a beacon of light for those lost in their own darkness. And he knew that as long as he shared his truth, he would continue to inspire others to embrace their shadows, to dance with their fears, and to find beauty in the intertwining of light and dark. And in that acceptance, the shadows transformed, no longer something to be feared, but rather a vibrant part of life's tapestry, an ever-present reminder that we are all beautifully complex, woven together by the threads of our experiences, both light and dark. Edward looked up at the night sky, the stars twinkling like 1,000 tiny lanterns. The moon hung high, casting a gentle glow over the world, illuminating the paths ahead. In that moment, he felt a deep sense of gratitude for every twist and turn that had led him to this place of understanding. The shadows would always be a part of him, but now they were allies in his journey, a reminder that no matter how dark the path may seem, there is always a flicker of light to guide the way home.